The storm had been merciless. Waves rose like mountains, black crests crashing against the fragile wooden hull of a vessel destined to break. When it finally shattered, scattering timbers across the Irish Sea, the night swallowed its crew whole. But fate, whether cruel or merciful, chose one man to survive. Daniel washed ashore at dawn, his body battered, his breath shallow, his eyes heavy with the weight of death itself. The tide that should have claimed him had instead delivered him to a forgotten cove. When he awoke, the world was gray, the sand cold beneath him, and his only certainty was pain. But he was not alone. Clara had seen him first, a broken figure upon the rocks. She was no stranger to tragedy. Her life, though outwardly quiet, was haunted by a sorrow she carried like a hidden wound. When she found him, something stirred in her, a strange pull between compassion and dread. This was no ordinary stranger. His face was carved with hardship, his eyes hollow yet burning with a storm that rivaled the sea itself. She brought him into her home. It was a modest place, a cottage shaped by years of solitude. Shadows lingered in its corners, and silence was its truest inhabitant. Daniel lay on the bed, fevered, his breath rattling. Clara tended to him with hands that trembled not from inexperience, but from a fear she could not name. To care for him was to invite something dangerous, something that whispered of change. For days, Daniel drifted between life and death. His voice, when it came, was low, ragged, heavy with secrets unspoken. He revealed nothing of his past, nothing of the storm that had brought him to her door. And yet, even in silence, he was a presence too strong to ignore. Clara felt it first, in the quiet moments, the way his gaze followed her, not with gratitude, but with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. He was grateful, yes, but beneath it was something else. Hunger, longing, a shadow in his eyes that frightened her and drew her closer all the same. And she, in turn, was not untouched. Clara's life had been a chain of repetitions, tending her garden, fetching water, existing in the narrow rhythm of a woman, both seen and unseen. But now, with Daniel's arrival, every heartbeat felt sharper. Every glance, every word exchanged carried a weight. He unsettled her, and yet she found herself lingering by his side, listening to his broken breaths as though they were music. One night, as the storm raged again beyond the cottage walls, Daniel spoke. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a rasp. Clara hesitated. "I only did what anyone would." "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the flickering light of the hearth. "Not anyone, you." It was such a simple truth, and yet it unraveled her. She had not been touched by words like that in years, perhaps ever. A warmth spread through her, dangerous and intoxicating. But Daniel was not a man without shadows. He carried them like a cloak. When he slept, he muttered names she did not recognize, cries of anguish torn from him as though demons haunted his dreams. Clara would sit by him, listening, wondering who he had lost, what he had done, and why fate had carried him to her and not to the grave. The days bled into weeks. Daniel regained his strength, though he still walked as if the sea clung to his bones. Clara tried to keep her distance, but the cottage was small, and the silence between them too alive. She noticed the way his hand brushed hers when passing the bread, the way his gaze lingered when she turned away. These were not accidents. These were tides pulling them closer. One evening, beneath the soft glow of the hearth, Clara asked the question that had gnawed at her since his arrival. "Why were you at sea? What brought you here?" Daniel paused, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse her. But then he spoke, slowly, each word heavy, running. "From the past, from debts, from men who wanted me dead, from myself." Clara shivered. She should have been afraid. Perhaps she was. Yet beneath the fear was something else, understanding. She too had ghosts. She too had lived with the weight of things unsaid, wounds unhealed. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. And yet, he murmured, "I am." The silence that followed was louder than any storm. The first time his hand touched her face. It was not gentle, it was desperate. He traced the line of her cheek with fingers roughened by years of toil and loss. She should have pushed him away, but she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the moment consume her. His lips followed, tasting of salt and longing, pressing against hers as though he had been starving his whole life for this one breath of warmth. The kiss was not just a kiss, it was surrender. It was a fire lit in a house long cold. Afterward, Clara sat in silence, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her mind torn between shame and hunger. Daniel watched her with eyes that seemed to see into the marrow of her soul. "You don't know me," she whispered. "Then tell me," he replied. "Let me know you, or let me ruin you." I no longer care. Which her breath caught. The danger in his words was real, but so was the truth. He had already begun to ruin her not with violence, but with desire. As Daniel grew stronger, the boundaries between them crumbled. Their days were filled with an uneasy rhythm, working side by side, sharing meals, exchanging glances that lingered too long. By night, shadows deepened, and the walls of the cottage became witnesses to whispers, confessions, and touches that neither of them could resist. But beneath it all, Clara sensed a storm yet to break. Daniel's past had not vanished. It lingered like smoke, clinging to him, a danger waiting just beyond the horizon. And her own heart, once steady, once safely guarded, was no longer her own. She was falling, and she knew the fall would hurt. Clara began to dream of him, even when he was near. She would wake in the night, listening to his breath beside her. Half terrified he would vanish, half terrified he would stay. For the first time in years, she felt alive, not safe, not secure, but alive. And that aliveness was more dangerous than death itself. Daniel, for his part, seemed both devoted and restless. He looked at Clara with a hunger that was more than desire, it was a need. She had become his anchor, his salvation. And yet she could see the shadows in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He was a man who had lost too much to believe in peace. One night, as they lay in the silence after their bodies had spoken the truths their mouths dared not, Daniel whispered, "You don't understand. Men like me, we don't get to keep good things." Clara pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the thunder of his heart. "Then let me be the first," she said. But even as she spoke, she feared the lie in her own words. For deep inside, she knew, nothing good survived the storm. The weeks stretched on, and Clara no longer remembered the days before Daniel. He was everywhere now, in her rooms, in her thoughts, in the rhythm of her pulse. His presence had changed her small cottage into something alive, filled with warmth and danger in equal measure. but the sea, ever restless, does not return what it takes without demanding a price. One evening, as twilight burned the horizon in shades of crimson, Daniel stood at the window, staring at the restless waves. Clara watched him from the doorway. His broad shoulders were tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "They'll come," he said finally, his voice low. Clara frowned. "Who?" "The men I left behind. The ones I owed. They don't forgive, Clara. They don't forget." A chill swept through her. For weeks she had lived in the illusion that he had been given to her by chance, by fate. But now reality bared its teeth. His past was not some shadow fading behind them. It was a tide. "You can run before they find you." Daniel turned, then, his gaze sharp and desperate. "And leave you. After all this, I can't." The weight of his words should have comforted her, but instead they bound her tighter to the dread gnawing at her. To love a man like Daniel was not salvation, it was surrender to the storm. That night, Clara dreamt of the sea, swallowing him again. She woke with tears on her face, Daniel's arm heavy across her waist, his breath steady in sleep. She studied him in the moonlight, tracing the scar along his jaw, the furrow in his brow, even in rest. He was beautiful in his ruin, and that beauty terrified her. She began to notice changes in him. He grew restless, pacing the cottage like a caged wolf. He would vanish for hours at dawn, returning with salt on his skin and secrets in his eyes. When she pressed him, he only shook his head. "Some things," he murmured, "you're better not knowing." But Clara was already not knowing was a wound that festered. The night they came was colder than any before. Clara heard it first, the sound of boots crushing gravel outside. Daniel was at the door in an instant, his hand pressed against the wood, as if bracing himself against fate itself. "They found me," he said, simply. Before Clara could speak, the door burst open. Two men stepped inside, shadows made flesh. Their faces were hard, their eyes cruel, their voices carrying the weight of debts unpaid. "Thought you could vanish?" Daniel's body tensed, every line of him ready for violence. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Please, quiet," the man snapped, his gaze cutting to her. For a moment, his lips curved into something like a sneer. "So this is what you've been doing, Daniel? Hiding with some woman while the world bleeds for you?" The words struck Clara harder than any blow. Daniel's hand shot out, shoving the man back, but steel glinted in the second intruder's grip. A knife, Clara's breath caught. In an instant, the cottage, the fragile sanctuary she had built, became a stage for ruin. "You'll come with us," the man with the knife said. "Alive, if you're lucky. Dead, if not," Daniel growled, a sound more beast than man. "Over my body." And then the storm broke. The fight was chaos. Daniel moved with a feral strength, years of desperation carved into every strike. The room filled with the crash of bodies against walls, the groan of wood underfoot, the gasp of breath torn from lungs. Clara pressed herself against the corner, her hands trembling, her heart a drumbeat of terror. Blood came quickly. The knife flashed, cutting deep across Daniel's arm. He roared, but did not falter. He drove one man into the hearth, flames sparking, smoke filling the room. The second lunged at Clara, his hand reaching for her throat. Daniel was faster. He struck with a force that shook the cottage itself, the man collapsing lifeless at Clara's feet. The other, burned and broken, fled into the night, leaving only silence and the stench of blood behind. Clara's breath came ragged. She looked at Daniel, his body slick with sweat and blood, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For the first time, she did not see a man saved from the sea. She saw a man claimed by violence, a man who carried death with him like a curse, and she loved him still. Afterward, Clara cleaned his wounds in silence. Daniel winced, but did not complain. His gaze never left her face, as though searching for judgment there. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said softly. "You brought it here," she whispered back, his jaw clenched. "Do you hate me for it?" She paused, her hands trembling as she bound the cloth around his arm. "No, that's the worst of it. I don't." Daniel leaned closer then, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we are both damned." And in that moment, she knew he was right. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The cottage, once alive with the dangerous warmth of their love, now felt haunted. Daniel grew quieter, his eyes darkened by a weight she could not lift. Clara, too, carried the burden of what she had witnessed, the knowledge that the world outside would never leave them in peace. One night, Daniel did not return. Clara sat awake until dawn, her fingers clenched around the hem of her dress, her breath shallow with dread. When he finally entered, his clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood. "They won't stop," he said, collapsing into a chair. "There will always be more. Men like me, we don't escape. We only delay." Clara knelt before him, her hands gripping his. "Then let's run together, far from here. We can vanish." Daniel looked at her then, his eyes so full of sorrow that her heart broke. "You deserve peace, Clara. I can't give it to you. All I bring is ruin." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then ruin me. I would rather be ruined by you than saved by anyone else." He kissed her then, fiercely, desperately, as though it were the last time. Perhaps he already knew it was. The end came with the sea dot. Another storm rose, black and merciless. Daniel stood on the shore, the waves crashing at his feet, his body outlined against the violent sky. Clara begged him to stay, to come back inside. But he only shook his head. "I was never meant for land," he said, his voice almost lost to the wind. "The sea took me once. It should have kept me." Clara clung to him, her cries swallowed by thunder. "Don't leave me, Daniel, please." He pressed one last kiss to her lips, salt and sorrow mingling. "I love you," he whispered. "That's why I must go." And before she could stop him, he waded into the storm. The waves rose to meet him, pulling him under, claiming what they had spared once before. Clara screamed until her voice broke. But the sea does not return what it takes twice. She never saw him again. In the years that followed, Clara lived alone in the cottage by the shore.